Please save my daughter. You are the only one who really can.
You're asking me to walk into a war?
The rain in Seoul doesn't just fall. It drowns the neon lights in a gray, suffocating veil. Seo Kwan, a man whose name usually commands a terrifying silence, stood in a trash-strewn alleyway with his tailored silk suit, soaking through to his skin. His empire was a fortress of steel and blood, yet it had been breached from within. Beside him, a black leather briefcase sat propped against a rusted dumpster. Its lid snapped open to reveal $10 million in tightly banded stacks. A king's ransom that, tonight, was worth less than the paper it was printed on. He wasn't looking at a high-level lieutenant or a rival boss. He was staring at Han Soo-yeon, a woman the world had long ago decided was invisible. Clad in a stained apron and a rain-slicked hoodie, she clutched a discarded sandwich like a treasure, her eyes sharp and wary. "They are watching my cars, my men, and my bank accounts," Kwan rasped, his voice cracking with a desperation that bypassed his usual cold exterior. "To them, I am a target. To them, you are nothing. That is why only you can bring my daughter back." As the $10 million briefcase sat ignored in the mud, the most powerful man in the city realized his daughter's life didn't depend on a shadow army, but on the mercy of a stranger who lived in the shadows he had spent a lifetime ignoring. Stick around until the very end to see how an invisible waitress outsmarts an entire criminal empire in this high-stakes race against time. If you enjoy gritty stories of redemption and suspense, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a chapter of this journey. The neon glow of Seoul's Gangnam district felt a world away from the damp, narrow veins of the city where Seo Kwan now found himself. Every shadow felt like a blade held to his throat, but it wasn't his own life that made his hands shake as he adjusted the lapels of his sodden overcoat. He was a man who had survived through extreme paranoia and security, a kingpin whose empire was built on the foundation of being untouchable. Yet tonight, that foundation had crumbled. His daughter, Minhei, was gone, taken by a ghost from a past he thought he had buried. His security detail, men he had paid millions to ensure his kingdom remained secure, had been useless. The kidnappers had moved with a methodical patience that suggested they knew his every protocol. They hadn't used a flashy getaway. They had used an unmarked, rusted van that blended perfectly into the city's decay. His high-tech surveillance grid had missed it. His street soldiers had blinked, and she was gone. But there was one person who hadn't blinked. Kwan stepped deeper into the alley, his expensive shoes splashing into a puddle of stagnant water. He stopped in front of a small, flickering light coming from the service entrance of a dilapidated 24-hour diner. There, sitting on a plastic milk crate, was Han Soo-yeon. She was a thin, shivering figure wrapped in an oversized, grease-stained hoodie, her posture guarded as she picked at a meager meal. To the rest of the world, she was a discarded element of society, a person who had forgotten how to be heard because men like Kwan had forgotten how to listen to those deemed powerless. "You saw it," Kwan said, his voice cutting through the steady drum of the rain. It wasn't a question. Soo-yeon didn't look up immediately. She took a slow breath, her eyes sharp and resilient despite the exhaustion etched into her features. She lived in the blind spots of the city, the places where the ghosts operated. She had seen the van because she was part of the landscape they thought was empty. "I saw a man with a scarred hand," she replied quietly, her voice steady. He didn't look like a kidnapper. He looked like he was coming home. Kwan felt a freight train of realization hit him. The description matched a man who should have been dead, a former partner who was now dismantling his life from the shadows. The realization that a traitor in his inner circle had allowed this to happen made his blood run cold. He looked at the woman before him, realizing that his wealth and his army were now liabilities. In a world of high-level underworld war, a child's connection to the streets was the only thread he had left to pull. He knelt in the dirt, ignoring the ruin of his suit, and placed the heavy briefcase between them. "They are at Pier 17, he whispered, the urgency in his voice rising as the cleaning house began. "My men can't get near it without them killing her. But you can walk right through the front door." Soo-yeon looked at the money, then at the desperate father hidden behind the Mafia mask. In that moment, the cold, untouchable boss was just a man, and the beggar was the only person with the power to save him. The heavy rain continued to batter the alley, creating a wall of sound that shielded their conversation from the prying ears of the city. Seoul Kwan stood up, his towering frame casting a long, jagged shadow over Han Soo-yun, but his usual aura of cold, untouchable authority was gone, replaced by a raw, frantic edge. He looked at the black SUVs idling at the mouth of the alley, their tinted windows hiding soldiers armed to the teeth. To any other enemy, that fleet was a death sentence. But tonight, those men were nothing more than targets painted in neon. If one of those cars moves toward Pier 17, my daughter dies before the tires hit the pavement. Kwan rasped, his eyes darting to the briefcase of cash that Soo-yun had yet to touch. He explained that the ghost sect hadn't just taken Minhei. They had turned his own strength against him. Every one of his men was documented, their faces known to the traitors in his inner circle. His empire was built on being seen and feared, but in the dead zone, that visibility was a fatal flaw. He was a man who had forgotten how to listen to the whispers of the streets, and now that silence was suffocating him. He looked down at Soo-yun, who remained motionless on her crate, the steam from her meager meal rising to meet the cold rain. "You don't understand," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. "In their world, my men are a freight train they can see coming from miles away. But you are the ghost they aren't looking for." He realized that her invisibility, the very thing that made the rest of Seoul look past her, was her greatest superpower. She could walk past the lookouts at the warehouse, slide through the rusted service hatches, and move through the shadows of the dead zone without a single head turning. Soo-yun finally looked up, her tired, weathered face reflecting a quiet strength that Kwan's millions could never buy. She saw the ghost of a desperate father behind the mask of a Mafia kingpin. She knew the city's underbelly better than any map or surveillance feed. She knew which floorboards groaned and which alleys led to dead ends. The wisdom from the streets was a currency Kwan had never valued until his life depended on it. "You're asking me to walk into a war," she said, her voice barely audible over the downpour. "I'm asking you to be the only person who can see what I've become blind to." Kwan replied, gesturing to the dead zone looming in the distance. The stakes were clear. If she refused, he would lose his daughter, his legacy, and the last shred of his humanity to a man who was methodical and patient in his cruelty. But if she accepted, she would become the unlikely ally in a tactical thriller that was only just beginning. As she slowly reached out a rain-slicked hand toward the briefcase, the cold nature of the boss began its first real shift toward a path of redemption. The transition from the neon-lit corridors of power to the dead zone was like descending into a cold, breathing grave. Soo-yun moved with a practiced, fluid silence, her worn hoodie blending into the crumbling concrete and rusted iron of the slums. Behind her, the world of Seoul Kwan, a man defined by his kingdom and his history of violent control, had vanished. Here, power wasn't measured in bank balances or bullets, but in the ability to remain unseen. The air grew thick with the smell of salt and rot as she approached Pier 17, the very place where the cleaning house had already begun. The dead zone was a labyrinth of urban decay, a sprawl of abandoned tenements and shipping containers that served as the base of operations for the ghost sect. These were men who operated like ghosts, methodical and patient, much like the former partner Kwan had once believed was dead. As Soo-yun slipped through a gap in a chain-link fence, she spotted the lookouts. They were high-level underworld soldiers, but they were trained to watch for armored SUVs and men in suits, the freight train of a Mafia retaliation. They didn't even glance at the shivering girl in the stained apron, who appeared to be just another discarded soul looking for shelter from the rain. Her invisibility was indeed a superpower, allowing her to navigate a path that Kwan's army could never touch without triggering a lethal response. She moved through the shadows of the warehouse district, her eyes sharp and calculating, picking up details that a high-tech surveillance grid would miss. She saw the flick of a cigarette in a restricted area and the subtle, rhythmic shift of guards moving in a methodical pattern. Every step was a high-stakes life-or-death situation. Yet Soo-yun felt a strange, quiet strength. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was the only thread of hope for a child she had never met. Deep within the bowels of the sector, the atmosphere shifted from suspenseful mystery to an urgent tactical thriller. Soo-yun reached the perimeter of the main stronghold, a place where the guards were no longer just watching the perimeter, but were actively cleaning house. She could feel the climax of tension building as she realized she was mere feet away from the enemy's heart. The girl was here, trapped in a fortress built on betrayal and wisdom from the streets. As Soo-yun pressed her back against a damp, freezing wall, she knew that the next few minutes would determine if Kwan's hope for redemption would survive or if they would both be swallowed by the ghosts of the past. Back in the sterile, cold air of his high-rise boardroom, Kwan stood by the window, but his mind was in the mud of the dead zone. He was a 63-year-old Mafia kingpin who had survived decades by trusting no one, yet now, his entire legacy rested on a homeless woman he barely knew. The atmosphere in the room was tense and gritty, shifting from a suspenseful mystery to an urgent tactical thriller as the minutes ticked by without a signal. Around the mahogany table sat his three most trusted lieutenants, Marco, Vincent, and Eddie, men who had served him for years but were now part of a circle of traitors. Kwan turned slowly, his expression intense and desperate, his eyes calculating every twitch and bead of sweat on their faces. He knew the cleaning house had begun. One of these men had faked the death of his former partner, Anthony Duca, 15 years ago, allowing a ghost to return and dismantle his organization from the shadows. The betrayal was methodical and patient, aimed at the $3 million arms deal that served as the backdrop for this coup. Kwan's reliance on fear and power had blinded him to the rot within his own kingdom. He had forgotten how to listen to the subtle shifts in loyalty. "The warehouse guards are missing at Pier 17, Kwan said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that triggered a freight train of realizations for the men in the room. He watched Eddie's hand tremble, just a fraction, near his Patek Philippe watch. It was the same watch Soo-yun had described seeing on the man who snatched his daughter. The stakes were no longer just about the empire. They were about the life of his child, Min-hye. Kwan felt his emotional armor cracking as the desperation of a father began to override the cold nature of a boss. He didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he reached for his phone, waiting for the one person who didn't exist in their world to send a signal that would change everything. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating, a high-stakes moment of tension where one wrong move would mean losing his life and his entire legacy. He realized then that his power was an illusion. He was a man who had survived through extreme paranoia, only to find that his only hope for redemption lay in the hands of a beggar he had previously deemed powerless. Beneath the rusted belly of Pier 17, the air was thick with the scent of diesel and old salt. Soo-yun moved through the sublevel of the warehouse, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was the dead zone, a place where the city's light refused to touch and where the ghosts of the underworld kept their secrets. She navigated the darkness with a quiet strength, her eyes sharp and compassionate as she searched for a child who had become the center of a high-level underworld war. She found Min-hye in a cramped, concrete basement, huddled on a moth-eaten mattress. The girl was a thin, shivering reflection of the woman who had come to save her. As Soo-yun knelt to scoop the child into her arms, she noticed something that stopped her breath. On the wall behind the girl hung a schematic of Kwan's private restaurant, marked with tactical entry points and timing notes for a massive arms shipment. This wasn't just about a ransom or a simple kidnapping. The abduction was the bait in a methodical and patient trap. The realization hit her like a freight train. The kidnappers didn't just want the $10 million. They were orchestrating a takeover of Kwan's entire empire, likely with the help of an internal traitor. By pulling Kwan's focus to the docks, the ghost from his past, Anthony Duca, had left the boss's main headquarters vulnerable for a cleaning house. The girl was never meant to be returned. She was a ticking clock designed to keep the boss distracted while his kingdom was dismantled from the shadows. Soo-yun felt the climax of tension, rising as the sound of heavy boots echoed on the floorboards above. The threat was no longer a future possibility. It was immediate and lethal. She looked at the terrified girl in her arms, then at the exit. She realized that Ael Kwan's cold nature had made him blind to this conspiracy, leaving him to rely on fear while his enemies relied on strategy. In this high-stakes life-or-death situation, Soo-yeon knew she couldn't just run. She had to find a way to warn the man who had treated her as invisible, or his hope for redemption would die in the basement of a forgotten pier. The silence of the basement was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the digital chirp of a dozen burner phones. The secret CEO Ael Kwan had tried to keep in the shadows. The $10 million briefcase offered to a beggar had leaked through the cracks of his compromised organization. In an instant, the high-stakes life-or-death situation shifted. Soo-yeon was no longer just a ghost moving through the dead zone. She was a walking fortune, and the wisdom from the streets told her that every desperate soul in the city was now her enemy. She clutched Min-hae tightly, feeling the girl's thin, shivering frame against her own. Above them, the methodical and patient footsteps of the ghost sect lookouts changed rhythm, becoming frantic as they realized their prize was being stolen by a woman who didn't exist. But the kidnappers weren't the only threat. Outside the warehouse, the freight train of greed had been unleashed. Street thugs, lured by the promise of a king's ransom, began to converge on Pier 17 like wolves scenting blood. The tone of the night turned from a suspenseful mystery to an urgent tactical thriller. Soo-yeon knew she couldn't use the main exits. They were already being compromised by men who would kill her just for a glance at that briefcase. She had to navigate the blind spots of a city that had suddenly turned its full, predatory gaze toward her. As she slipped into a narrow ventilation shaft, she could hear the climax of tension rising, the sound of splintering wood, and the shouts of men who had forgotten how to listen to anything but the sound of money. The stakes had reached a breaking point. If Soo-yeon failed, Ael Kwan would lose his entire legacy and his daughter, while she would become another nameless victim of the Underworld's cold nature. Yet, as she moved through the darkness, her emotional armor remained intact. She wasn't fighting for the $10 million. She was fighting for the child, providing a hope for redemption that even the most powerful Mafia boss couldn't buy. The hunt had truly begun, and the ghost was now the most wanted woman in Seoul. The ventilation shaft was a freezing, narrow coffin of corrugated steel, smelling of old rust and rain. Soo-yeon pressed her back against the metal, her legs trembling from the weight of Min-hae, who had finally drifted into a fitful, exhausted sleep in her lap. Outside the vents, the dead zone was alive with the frantic sounds of a hunt. Heavy boots thudding on concrete, and the guttural shouts of men realizing their $10 million prize was slipping through the cracks. In the oppressive dark, the only light came from the small, encrypted radio Ael Kwan had forced into her hand. When the device crackled to life, his voice didn't sound like the cold, untouchable kingpin who ruled Seoul from a high rise. It was low, frayed, and stripped of its armor. "I can hear them through the open line," Ael Kwan whispered, the sound of his own heavy breathing filling the small space. "They're closing in on the north perimeter. You need to move, Soo-yeon." "Move where?" she shot back, her voice a sharp, desperate hiss. "The streets are full of people who want that briefcase. Your money didn't buy safety, Ael Kwan. It just turned me into a target." There was a long silence on the other end, a moment where the freight train of his power seemed to stall. "I know," he said, and for the first time, the arrogance was gone. "I spent 30 years building a kingdom where I thought I could control every shadow. I thought if I had enough, nothing could be taken from me. But while I was looking at the ledgers, I forgot how to look at my daughter. I made her a ghost in her own home long before the kidnappers did." Soo-yeon shifted, the cold metal biting into her shoulder. "I was a ghost before I even hit the streets," she said softly, her eyes watching the flickering shadow of a patrol passing beneath the vent. "When my parents left, I waited for anyone to look at me, to see that I was shivering. But the world only sees what it can use. You used your power to become invisible at the top, and I used my hunger to become invisible at the bottom. We're both just hiding in the dark, Ael Kwan." The radio hummed with static, a bridge between two worlds that should never have touched. In that moment, the high-stakes life-or-death situation felt secondary to the raw, emotional arc of two discarded souls finding a reflection in one another. Kwan wasn't just a boss anymore, and Soo-yeon wasn't just a waitress. They were two people who had survived by hardening their hearts, only to realize that their emotional armor was what had left them so alone. "I can't reach you with my men," Kwan said, his voice regaining a methodical but weary focus. "But I can guide you through the old drainage tunnels under the pier. They were built during the war. They don't exist on the modern city maps. You have to trust the shadows, Soo-yeon. You have to trust that you're the only one who knows how to navigate a world that doesn't want to be seen." Soo-yeon looked down at Min-hae's peaceful face and felt a surge of quiet strength. The wisdom from the streets had taught her to fear everyone, but the desperation in the father's voice provided a strange hope for redemption. She adjusted her grip on the child. "Tell me where to turn," she whispered into the dark. "We're coming out." The descent into the tunnels was like falling out of the world and into the city's cold, concrete veins. Soo-yeon adjusted her grip on Min-hae, the girl's small weight pulling at her exhausted muscles as they dropped through a rusted maintenance hatch. Above them, the dead zone was in a frenzy. The muffled thud of boots and the frantic shouts of street thugs echoed through the metal. But as the hatch slammed shut, the noise was replaced by the rhythmic, heavy dripping of stagnant water. Through the radio, Kwan's voice was a methodical tether to reality. "The tunnels run south, Soo-yeon. They were cut off from the main subway line in the 90s. Follow the yellow markings on the pipes. If you reach the junction where the water runs fast, you've gone too far." The extraction was an urgent tactical thriller, played out in the dark. Soo-yeon moved with a quiet strength, her feet splashing through calf-deep, icy water that numbed her skin. Every splash felt like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She navigated by touch and the faint, blue glow of her radio screen, her wisdom from the streets telling her exactly how to move through the narrow, suffocating spaces. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a ghost navigating a labyrinth that the Mafia's freight train of power could never enter. Suddenly, a metallic clang echoed from behind them. The climax of tension spiked as a beam of light sliced through the darkness several hundred yards back. The ghost sect had found the hatch. "They're in the tunnels," Soo-yeon hissed into the radio, her breathing coming in shallow, ragged bursts. "Listen to me," Kwan rasped, his voice tight with the father's desperation. 50 meters ahead, there's an old ventilation fan. It's rusted shut, but the housing is loose. Push through it. It leads to the abandoned Yangdongpo substation. I have a car waiting at the service exit. You have to be fast, Soo-yeon. They are cleaning house. They won't take prisoners." With the girl clinging to her neck, Soo-yeon sprinted. The water resisted her, pulling at her legs, but the hope for redemption burned hotter than the cold. She reached the fan, the massive iron blades looking like the teeth of a trapped beast. Using every ounce of her inner resolve, she jammed a discarded iron bar into the housing and heaved. With a scream of protesting metal, the frame gave way. She shoved Min-hae through the gap, just as the flashlights of the pursuers rounded the corner. As Soo-yeon scrambled through, a bullet sparked off the concrete inches from her head. They tumbled into the dry, dust-choked air of the abandoned subway station. The transition from the high-stakes life-or-death situation of the tunnels to the eerie silence of the station was jarring. They ran past gutted ticket booths and rusted turnstiles, the ghosts of a city that had long ago moved on. At the end of a long, dark escalator, a single set of headlights cut through the gloom. The service exit. The car was there, not a flashy SUV, but a nondescript armored sedan. As the door swung open, Soo-yeon didn't see a Mafia boss. She saw a man whose emotional armor had completely shattered. The great escape was over, but the final transformation was only just beginning. The armored sedan sat idling at the edge of the industrial district, its headlights cutting two lonely paths through the receding mist. When the door opened, Kwan didn't wait for his bodyguards. He stepped out into the mud, his movements stripped of their usual calculated grace. As Soo-yeon emerged from the shadows of the subway exit, carrying the sleeping Min-hae, the legendary boss of Seoul's Underworld simply stopped. The freight train of his ambition had finally reached the end of the tracks. He reached out, his hands trembling as he took his daughter from Soo-Yun's arms, pulling the girl into a fierce, desperate embrace that finally shattered his cold nature. For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine and the soft sobs of a man who had realized that his entire legacy was contained in the small, breathing life he held. Min-Hei stirred, clutching her father's damp lapels, and Aelquan looked over her shoulder at Soo-Yun. She stood a few paces back, her thin, shivering frame looking more resilient than any of the steel and glass towers he owned. The black briefcase sat on the floor of the car's back seat, the $10 million still waiting, yet the air between them had changed. "The car will take you wherever you want to go," Aelquan said, his voice thick and unrecognizable. "The money is yours. It's the least I owe you for giving me back my life." Soo-Yun looked at the briefcase, then at the father and daughter. A quiet strength settled over her features. She reached into the car, but she didn't grab the stacks of cash. Instead, she pulled out a small, warm blanket and the thick envelope she had been given for expenses at the start of the night, enough to find a room and a hot meal for a few months. "I don't want the 10 million, Aelquan," she said softly, her eyes sharp and compassionate. "That money is what built the walls between you and her. If I take it, I'm just another person you've bought. I'd rather stay a ghost." Aelquan watched her, finally understanding the wisdom from the streets she had shared in the dark of the tunnels. Power wasn't about what you could take. It was about what you were willing to protect. He nodded slowly, a silent pact of respect forming between the kingpin and the waitress. He knew his cleaning house wasn't over. There were still traitors to deal with and an empire to dismantle or reform. But for the first time, he saw a hope for redemption that didn't involve blood. As the sun began to bleed a pale, watery gold over the Seoul skyline, Soo-Yun turned and walked away. She didn't look back at the luxury car or the fortune she had left behind. She disappeared into the morning mist, moving with the ease of someone who truly knew the city's heart. Behind her, Aelquan climbed into the car and pulled the door shut, not to hide from the world, but to finally be present in the one that mattered. The invisible girl had saved the daughter, but in the process, she had forced the boss to finally see himself.